how they work. But one of the cool things about my job is, I guess about 5 years ago or so, I kind of embarked on a journey where I actually made a movie about coral reefs. So my movie is called Chasing Coral, and it's on Netflix. So most of you can probably just jump online and see that if you'd like. But the goal of our film was to document corals in their kind of normal state, so to speak, or while they're healthy and happy, and take pictures of them over a couple months and visualize how they change because of exactly what you just talked about, because of things like pollution, and more importantly, because of how our ocean is warming. So a coral is a really, really fascinating creature. Raise your hand if you think that corals are animals. Raise your hand if you think they're plants. All right, so you guys nailed it. Corals are actually animals, even though they probably look more like plants. But what makes them really, really cool is they actually have plants inside of their skin. So if you think about it, if it were like you and me, instead of having lunch, we would probably have like green skin. We might have some leaves inside of our skin. And instead of eating lunch, we would go outside and we would sunbathe. And the little plants in our skin would actually produce our food for us. So we wouldn't have to eat because we would actually use it. Kind of cool, right?
Yeah.
I think you cut off for just a second in the middle of what you were saying there. Yeah, would you mind repeating that last part?
Yeah, essentially what I'm trying to do is give you a little bit of perspective as to how they work. And essentially, if we were a coral, instead of having lunch and like eating a hamburger, we would actually just eat the sunlight. So we would go outside and we would sunbathe, and we would have little plants in our skin that would actually make our food for us.
It's different.
Kind of weird, right? So the problems that I work on with coral reef is called coral bleaching. And this actually goes back to what we're talking about with these little algae that live inside of the coral. Corals actually build a skeleton. This is a coral skeleton right here. And you can tell that it's bright white. So if you think about, you guys have seen pictures of coral reefs. Coral reefs aren't white, right? They're really, really colorful. It turns out that corals themselves actually have no color at all. It's the algae that provides them their color. So I actually have my corals right here so I can show you them. See how pretty those are? There's lots of different colors. There's some oranges and greens and blues. And all of those colors you're seeing are those little tiny algae that's living inside their tissue. When corals get too warm, if they get too hot, those little algae kind of freak out. They stop doing what they're supposed to be doing, and they actually start hurting the coral. Instead of producing their food, they actually start producing really nasty stuff that's bad for the coral. It's kind of similar to having a cold. When you get a cold, you got a bunch of stuff in your nose that's not making you feel very well. And so what do you do to try and get rid of it? We blow our nose, right? We're trying to get rid of something that's harming us. Corals do the same thing. They spit out all of their colors or their algae. And what they leave behind is just a layer of transparent or see-through tissue, and you can see the skeleton underneath it. And so an entire coral reef can actually turn bright white. And that's what we call coral bleaching. They've essentially lost their food source. They can no longer eat their sunlight, and so they kind of starve to death. And we've lost a lot of coral reefs because of this over the past 5 years or so. Where I work is the Great Barrier Reef. So I work in the super far north Great Barrier Reef, an area that's an area of water called the Torres Strait, which sits between Australia and Papua New Guinea. in those areas, we've lost about 50% or half of the corals in the past 4 or 5 years. So it's become a really serious issue that people are starting to talk about finally, in large part because of our movie, but also because people have begun to care about these places more because they're really beautiful and they're important because a lot of things in our ocean rely on corals. They're kind of like the nurseries of the sea. About a third of all life in our oceans, and our oceans are really big, they make up nearly 2/3 of our planet. Nearly a third of all that life lives on coral reefs. So they're very important, and lots of animals and plants and other things live on a coral reef. So really, really interesting. Do you guys have any questions?
Aaron, what can we do to stop coral bleaching?
Yeah, it's a really, really big question. And there's not really a straightforward answer, unfortunately. I think that the answer is actually very particular to where everybody lives. The issues that coral reefs are facing are in large part due to the fact that our entire planet is actually getting warmer, and that pushes the corals over the edge. So one of the things that we need to think about is what our own little communities can do to help that, to limit our own impacts on coral reefs. So for me, I grew up in Colorado. I live just about as far away from the ocean as I possibly can get. So the answer for me is probably a lot different than maybe somebody that lives right on the Great Barrier Reef, for instance. But I think what it comes down to is whether it's in your classroom or in your school or at your home, it's all about how can I be more sustainable or more respectful to the natural world. It can be things as simple as using less plastics, because plastics are really bad for the ocean, to just limiting the amount of like energy we use. So turning off the light when you leave a room, or not driving when you don't have to. Things like that actually add up if everybody's participating. So it's a really big question, but I think that's probably the best way to look at it is what can you do as yourself or as your classroom to make the world a better place?
Does that answer your question, Aaron? Yes. Great. Okay. Andrew, you have a question?
Yeah. So, would it help if like we cleaned coral reefs? Like if we clean them?
Yeah, for sure. So there are lots of different like variables that can, make corals sad, so to speak. And one of those is like cleaning up just the area that they live. So things like sewage runoff. So a lot of areas in the world will actually, have a really bad impact on corals just because their rivers are pretty dirty. And so if we clean things like rivers that are near coral reefs, or even go out and collect plastics or garbage from the ocean, it really, really helps the corals a lot.
Okay, Juliet?
Why does coral need their color to survive?
Yeah, so corals need their color because the color is actually the little plants, and those plants are providing it its food. So if they don't have their color, then they're no longer really able to eat. So they actually can starve if they lose their color for too long. Thankfully, some corals can actually bring that color back after a little while. If the water gets cooler, those corals will actually get bright and colorful once again.
Does that answer your question, Juliet?
But like after when it turns into like a skeleton, like the bone, can the algae come again into the coral, and then we can okay.
Yeah, totally. It all depends on how long it stays hot. So if it stays hot longer than like a month, then they don't have a really good chance of bringing it back. But if it gets cooler within a month, they'll probably survive and the color will come back.
Okay, thank you.
It's a good question.
Lena?
Um,
Really loud, honey.
how can you like save coral reefs and like how the fish that is like living near it to not
So the way that I go see coral reefs is I mostly work in Australia, but I've worked in lots of different places like throughout the Caribbean and in Hawaii. So first it takes getting there, but most importantly, you've got to be able to scuba dive. So I'm a big scuba diver. I've spent about 250 to 300 hours of my life underwater. So we go down into the water, and I usually bring some cameras. I usually have some notebooks, and we actually go sit on the reef and we do our work underwater. So we take data underwater and we write things down and we take photographs that then we can bring back and look at for kind of scientific purposes. But all of it's done underwater, which is a little unusual and a little bit of a different working environment, but it's actually really cool because although I work on coral reefs, which are just stationary skeletons essentially underwater, we still get to run into all those other things, like you're saying with fish, and every now and then we get lucky and see things like dolphins or sharks or whales. So we're in their environment, and the things that we run into are pretty cool.
So, Lena, you were asking about saving it, right?
Yeah.
So, is that the same question that Erin had? What can we do to save it? Well, do you remember how he answered Erin's question about using less plastic and going to the beach and cleaning up garbage from the floor, from the ground? Those are things that you can do to save the coral reef. Is that what you were asking about? Okay. Well, what's your question?
how long has coral bleaching been like, going on for? Like when did coral bleaching really start?
That's a really good question. So coral bleaching is a fairly new thing that we're beginning to see. The first documentation of very serious coral bleaching is in the mid 1980s. And then we kind of had a little break. That one wasn't very serious, but in 1998, we had a really bad bleaching event that was all over the world. And then we see it again in 2010. And then the big one that I worked on lasted from 2015 through 2017. And that was like a 3-year period where bleaching was kind of spotting up all around the planet. And we lost a really large amount of corals, but it's, only been about 30 years since this has been an issue. And it's a consequence of us making the planet a little warmer as time goes on. Right now, we're in a period where the threat or the potential for corals to get in trouble is really high.
Did that answer your question well?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so about 30 years that it's been serious. Bert?
How do you work underwater? Like, how do you do your work?
Yeah, so working underwater is very, very different than working above water. The biggest problem that I face is really a time limitation. So when you're scuba diving, you really only have about 2 hours or so to get all of your work done. And sometimes you don't get all of it done, and that means you have to go back to the surface, put on a new tank, and go back under for another 2 hours to keep working. But a lot of it just comes down to kind of two major things. The first one is being very, very calm. Being calm is kind of the name of the game underwater because you don't want to be using your air too fast. So if you're breathing too much, that can be a problem. But it's a lot of focus and a lot of calm and a lot of being aware of your surroundings. So with scuba diving, you don't want to be sinking and you don't want to be floating. You want to be buoyant right in the middle so you're not really going anywhere. It's kind of like being in outer space, actually. kind of in zero gravity, so to speak. You're just floating there in the water, and you just have to be able to focus on the work you're doing.
What do you think, Burke? Does that answer your question?
I actually want to know, like,
A little louder, honey.
I want to know, like, how, like, how you take pictures and write down your notes.
Say that again? I'm not sure I caught it.
Louder, Burke.
How do you, like, take your pictures and write down your notes?
Yeah, it's a good question. So first, for the camera or the pictures, I have a really nice camera that actually goes inside of like, it's called a housing. Essentially like a big metal container with a hole at the forward where the lens is that actually allows me to take my camera underwater. So it's just a very special container that the camera goes in that makes sure that it doesn't get wet. And that allows me to take pictures underwater, which is pretty cool. And then as for writing, we have very special notebooks, or what we call a slate. And it's basically underwater paper. You use a normal pencil, no different than the ones that you guys use at school, and we can write freely, and that's actually how we talk to each other as well. If we have to explain something, we can write it down and show it to somebody. And sometimes we even use sign language.
Is that what you were thinking, Burke? Does that help you? Okay. Okay. Destiny?
So, like,
Really loud, honey.
how long have you been, like, when did this all, like, when was the first time that you went down in the water scuba diving, when you first started scuba diving?
Yeah. So when I was your guys' age, I was very lucky. My dad and my mom are both teachers, and they actually run a program where they take students out to Hawaii for high school credit. And so when I was your guys' age, I would spend my summers in Hawaii, and I started free diving and exploring the reefs, like at that point in my life. And then when I was probably like 13 or 14 years old, I really got interested in coral, and I started working in the aquarium industry, where I did things like this, where I worked with corals and set up cool aquariums with corals in them. And I started scuba diving about the same time, when I was like 14 years old.
Does that answer your question, Destiny? Okay. Does anybody have any more questions? Noah? Really loud.
Is that your day job? Is that your day job?
So you're asking, is this what he does for a living? Is this his job?
Yeah, absolutely. So I get to do a lot of different things, but the number one thing I do is actually this. So I work with kids a lot and work with students a lot, to talk about coral reefs and to teach people about, A, how cool they are, and secondly, how important they are to protect, and to educate people about why they're in a little bit of trouble right now. But secondly, I do get to go out in the field and go live on boats and live on little islands and work on corals directly and work with other people that like corals just like me. So it's like a happy bridge of education as well as doing a little bit of science as well. It's a really good question. But I guess you could call it a day job.
Mm-hmm. How many of you guys think you might be interested at some point in maybe having your job be like a marine biologist, or where you might make a movie about different things that are happening in the ocean? And yeah, some of you. Okay, so if they're interested in doing this kind of work, what was your journey like? How did you get to where you are?
Yeah, I think the most important piece of advice I could give would be to just really stay interested in whatever it is that, you find really exciting. Some people like me like coral, but there's so many different things out there that you could end up working on. I know people that work on like green slime, and they get really excited about it. Whatever it is that makes you excited, it could be dolphins, it could be elephants, it could be chimpanzees. If there's something that you're really interested in and makes you really excited, I would say continue to learn about it and continue to be interested, because a good scientist has to be kind of obsessed with whatever they study. We have a really deep relationship with what we like. But for me, I think the most important thing to realize, and you guys are probably a little far away from this, but once you get to college, a lot of people, I think, get sort of overwhelmed by maybe not knowing what they want to do. And for me, it was just keeping it very general. Just studied biology in general, not marine biology, not coral reef biology. I just kind of studied nature and how the world works and how things work together in nature to make a happy ecosystem. And from there, I found my pathway into the world that I was really interested in, which was corals. So I think it really just comes down to like being really excited and passionate about something. And also always remembering that even if you don't become a scientist, but you're still interested in, maybe the environment, you can still use your skill sets that you have to work in that space, which is really exciting. So the best example would be like, I made a movie about coral reefs, and there were scientists, there were filmmakers, there are producers, lawyers, accountants, all kinds of different jobs that all came together to make one team to help coral reefs. I think it's really cool that you can do anything that you want and always be able to bring it back to whatever you're interested in.
Okay. So does anyone who did not ask a question have one? Ethan, what's your question? Oh, you don't have a question? Okay. All right, so Destiny, did you have one more question?
I wanted to say something.
Okay, go ahead.
So like when I grow up, I want to have 2 jobs. So like my first job is I want to be like a singer, but then I also want to like study like the ocean and like sing songs about the ocean and stuff. So I'm thinking, because like I'm interested in nature, so like I will like, if I'm at the beach, I will want to see if I can find like more shells and stuff. And then sometimes if I'm at the beach and I get lucky, I would even, and I want to, I would even go into the ocean for a little bit and just feel around the sand and feel like I could feel like any nature or a fish. Because sometimes fish like swim towards you when you go into the ocean. So like sometimes I might get lucky and that might happen to me sometimes. So like I just like feel around for shells, and then sometimes fish just come over to me when I'm looking for shells.
So Destiny, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second. So that would be a pretty cool way to raise awareness for people about the ocean or whatever you want to write about by singing about it. That would be pretty cool. You could even start that now. You could write some songs about the ocean in your notebook.
I mean, the first I get over stage fright, which I sort of get over.
Oh, wow.
So when you go out older, you sometimes get over things that you used to be scared of, like stage fright. Some people get over it like when they're adults or like teenagers. But like when
So Destiny, honey, hold on. Let's stop here for a sec, okay? So maybe you start to do this now, and we can worry about the performance stuff another time. That's a really interesting idea, though. Yeah.
I think it's a great idea. One of the most important things that I've learned over, the past 5 years or so is that one of the most important things in the world is a bridge between art and science. And that's exactly what you're talking about, like singing songs about the ocean or even making artwork with the shells that you find. All of those things tell really cool stories, and they come from passionate people like you. And those are some of the most powerful ways to help coral reefs and help the ocean. So I say go for it.
Great. Okay. Lena, do you have another question?
Something to add up that way.
You have to be a lot louder, honey, because the camera is all the way over there with the microphone.
I have something to add on to Destiny. She can always do, like, we have this talent show. It was already done in 3rd grade, but next year she can write about a song or do like a choral song and a talent show for the kids.
For sure, I like it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, do you have any other information that you can give us or anything else that you wanted to show us before we have to get going?
I don't necessarily have anything else that I usually plan on. We kind of went over the gist of coral bleaching in general, but I don't necessarily have too much else unless people still have questions. I know I'm still available for like another 15 minutes or so, so I'm happy to continue asking questions. I'd rather hear what you guys have to say than me continue talking at you.
Okay, great. So, guys, think if you have any other questions. Ethan, it looks like you might have one. So really loud.
You studied about fish as well?
Little loud.
Do you also study about fish as well?
Do I also study fish as well? Not usually, so I'm not too much of a fish guy. But fish are really important to corals. Some fish actually need a particular coral. They'll live on a coral for their entire life. One of the cool things about coral is because have really cool structures, right? So you've got all this space in between these kind of pokey parts. Fish can actually, hide inside of a coral or use it to their advantage to hide from things like predators. So corals are really fascinating in that way, that they have really close relationships with the fish that live near them. But other people tend to study the fish, and I stick on the coral side of things. But there are lots of really amazing things in the ocean that work with corals. I think one of my favorites is dolphins. Dolphins are really, really cool creatures because they're incredibly smart. They actually use language just like we do. They have names for each other. They use full sentences. They play. They do things for fun. So they're really cool creatures. And they actually are really good at using teamwork. All whales and dolphins, and we call them cetaceans, but it just means marine mammals. They're incredibly smart. In fact, they're almost as smart as us from a brain size perspective. Their brains are much larger than ours, actually.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay, Nikki?
What kind of fish hide in the coral and spend their lives around the coral?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different answers. Some fish use the coral just for their habitat. So there are little blue fish. They're called chromis. They're kind of like a damselfish, but they create these big schools. You could probably have 50, 60 of these little fish that will live on a coral head. And let's say a predator swam by the coral and saw these fish. They could be swimming up above. So the fish will be here on the coral. And when the predator swims by, they'll all sink down into the coral and hide inside all of the structures. And then there are other fish that actually eat coral. So things like butterfly fish, for instance, fish that have really long noses. They're the ones that actually pluck little babies out of the coral. So a coral is actually made up of things called polyps. I don't know if my camera is good enough to see in this coral, but if you can see all the little dots, those are all individual corals. So this little skeleton in my hand probably has 10,000 polyps on it, and they're all individual corals. And there are some fish that actually come up and they'll use their little straw-like mouth to suck up some of those polyps and eat them. So they don't kill the coral because otherwise they'd run out of food, but they eat little bits of it at a time and don't kill it enough to where they would run out. So it's kind of cool that the relationships with fish and coral are all very different. Some of them are quite nice to the coral and use them for protection. Other fish eat coral. And other fish could even use coral to hunt. They could, know the reef so well that they actually use it to their advantage, kind of. It's like their own neighborhood.
Does that answer your question, Nikki?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Andrew?
So, can a fish get stuck in there?
They probably could. I don't think it's very likely. But some fish, like let's say you have a fish that might have died for some reason, if it lands on the coral will actually eat it. So corals have these polyps like we just talked about, and at night when their sunshine food goes away, they can actually open up and eat things. They mostly eat things like algae and little phytoplankton, the small things in the water. But every now and then they can actually eat a fish if the opportunity was right.
Wow. That's super interesting. I didn't know that. Andrew, what do you think about that?
I think that's really weird because I can't believe like all those little dots can like eat like one big fish.
Totally. So corals are actually related to jellyfish and anemones. So you guys know what jellyfish are, and an anemone is like in Finding Nemo. You know Nemo's house? That's called an anemone. And what makes all three of those things, corals, anemones, and jellyfish, very similar is they have something called a nematocyst. And that's a big word that basically just means a stinging cell. And so they all actually have these special little cells in their skin that can actually sting things. They kind of latch on to them. That's why a jellyfish sting hurts really bad, right? And that's actually how they eat. They something accidentally touches the coral, and they shoot out these cells to kind of trap them, and then they can eat them. It's kind of cool.
Wow. That would be pretty interesting to see if someone had a video recording of it happening.
I think there are some on YouTube. I can send you guys a video of a nematocyst shooting off. They're very cool. It's kind of like a coil inside of a cell, and when something touches it, that coil kind of bursts right out, kind of like a harpoon. It's like a little needle, basically, and it can inject venom, but most of them are totally harmless, especially with coral. There are some really scary jellyfish, but corals are mostly harmless.
That would be cool, yeah. That would be neat to see. Burke?
What do you take notes of?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
What do you take pictures of and notes of? Like,
Take pictures of what?
what do you take pictures of and notes of? Like, do you just take pictures of coral bleaching, or do you like take videos or something?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both. Sometimes I take pictures just for fun. Like if a dolphin comes up to me, for instance, like I'm trying my best to take a picture of the dolphin because it's hard to get a picture of, some of the life that's maybe a little bit more rare on a coral reef. But most of the pictures I take are actually of the same exact corals over and over and over again. So I take a picture of a coral and watch how it changes while it's bleaching. So my goal is to take pictures of, a healthy, colorful coral and take them day after day and watch how they change as they get warmer. So it's kind of called a time lapse. So I can take, 3 months of photographs and I can put them all together and in, like a minute or so be able to watch how they changed over those months. And then we also took a lot of video as well when I was making the movie.
Bert, does that sound like something that's interesting to you that you would want to do? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you like technology stuff, so that would be good for you.
It's definitely a world that needs a lot more technology. The fun, I guess it's fun, but also a little frustrating, is the underwater world is not very kind to technology and to electronics. So it takes a lot of creativity and a lot of kind of fun experimenting to make things work underwater. That's a huge area that we need more help in.
Okay, does anyone else have any other questions? Is this a question, Destiny? No, okay. Other questions? No, another question? Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, if you come across a video like that, that would be really neat to see.
Yeah, I'll send it over in Skype. I'm sure that I can find one of them. It's probably like a microscope image, but you'll definitely be able to see these cool little cells. They're pretty interesting.
Pretty neat. Okay. All right, guys. Well, why don't we give a big thank you? Yeah, and if you're
Awesome question.
yeah, if you're interested, you guys can check out the Netflix video at home with your families, the one that we saw the trailer of. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much.
No problem. You guys have a good rest of your day, and I'll send over a video here in a minute.
Thank you.
All right, bye, guys.
Okay, bye-bye. You guys can wave bye. Bye.